Hello and welcome to this session of the Microsoft Research Summit 2021. My name is Darren Edge. I'm a director in the Societal Resilience group at Microsoft Research, and today I'm talking about technologies that we're building to help translate real-world data into real-world evidence. Now, this notion of real-worldliness emerged in the medical space to differentiate from the highly controlled nature of data and evidence emerging from randomized controlled trials in the clinical space. But we found broad applicability of these ideas to societal problems beyond healthcare, especially for those situations where it's not possible, practical, or ethical to conduct a randomized controlled trial. And real data and evidence play a key role in our societal resilience research agenda, because only by translating data into evidence can we inform the policies, decisions, and actions that move us towards a more equitable and resilient society. So here we can see several domains where we need to build more resilience as a society. In each case, there's a large system of activities supporting vulnerable groups of individuals in the real world. And today in this talk, I'm talking mostly about victims of human trafficking and exploitation, because that's one of the key kind of areas for us in the societal resilience group. But I hope to persuade you that the need to protect the privacy of vulnerable populations and to develop policies that support the needs of those populations applies equally to healthcare patients as it does to victims of trafficking. And just as all of these activities need collective evidence-based action, all of them also suffer from real-world barriers that disrupt this process. So here's the process that we're trying to support. Given a problem, we collect data that describes the problem, we translate that data into evidence, and we use the evidence to inform the actions that help us to make progress against the problem. But in practice, we meet barriers. In particular, access to private data is a significant barrier. So if you have data that describes vulnerable kind of groups of individuals, you very often can't share that data because of privacy concerns and data protection regulations. But if you don't have access to the relevant data as a policymaker, this process is disrupted. Similarly, if you don't have access to the data science skills that let you translate data in general to specific points of evidence, you won't have the evidence available to then go ahead and act on, and the process is disrupted. And finally, if the decision makers don't have access to the means of evidence development, they might not understand how evidence is developed and dismiss it. They may decide that some relevant data wasn't included or it was overlooked. And again, this can disrupt the whole end-to-end process. So our approach is to create accessible tools for evidence development by domain experts who are the ultimate decision makers. And this applies on two levels. The first is helping people to share evidence of correlation within private data sets. This is, this kind of exploratory analysis is where hypotheses come from. We know, generating hypotheses is not the same as confirming hypotheses, and the correlations are not causation, but it's a necessary start. So we need tools to support this. We also need a different kind of tool to support this process of developing evidence of causation from observational data that's already been collected. And most real-world data is both private and observational in nature, so we really need these tools. And we need them because we want to support collective action within communities at the speed and scale of real-world problems. So let's talk now about developing evidence of correlation from private data. So this challenge emerged from Microsoft's participation in the Tech Against Trafficking coalition. This is a coalition of technology organizations, including Microsoft, Amazon, BT, and Salesforce, designed to combat trafficking with technology. And in particular, it arose through the inaugural accelerator program with the Counter Trafficking Data Collaborative, or CTDC. So CTDC is an initiative run by IOM, and it pulls data from IOM, Polaris, Liberty Shared, and others to create the world's largest database on identified victims of trafficking. And it makes a subset of that data, after it's been de-identified and anonymized, available via the CTDC website. But it uses a technique called Anonymity to anonymize that data, and it has some issues. So here's an illustration of what the underlying data set looks like from CTDC. Each row is a record describing an individual victim of trafficking, and each column is an attribute that describes either the individual or their trafficking case. So K-anonymity requires you to identify which of these attributes are quasi-identifiers, things that describe people or individuals that may be identifying when used in combination. And so age, gender, and citizenship were the ones chosen by CTDC. K-anonymity says that these quasi-identifiers, the sets of quasi-identifier values, must be shared by at least K records for publication, otherwise the records are suppressed. And you can already imagine how this might impact the utility of these data sets in terms of preserving data set level statistics. But that's not the only problem. there's a residual privacy risk around the topic of member inference. So this is a risk whenever any attribute combination is rare in the data set and linkable to a real-world group whose known size is about the same as the count of records you can find in that data set. Membership inference is a risk because for victims of traffic, membership of a data set like this implies collaboration with authorities, which can prompt retaliation against the victim or their friends or family in ways that pose a safety risk. So this is very clear in the case where we find a unique individual in the data set, and we believe that corresponds to a unique individual in the world, which a trafficker may very well be able to reason about if they have in-depth knowledge about victims and how they were trafficked in some kind of unusual context or unusual way. But it's also a problem for small groups of individuals. So these last three records you can see here, they're all the same. But if you're a trafficker that controls the route between Philippines and Saudi Arabia, and you think you have maybe lost track of three individuals, and you see these three records in this data set, you may very well infer that those individuals were actually the ones who collaborated with the authorities. And this is the kind of issue we'd like to avoid. And I said there's a problem with this approach. So when CTDC used this method on their entire database, it suppressed 40% of the records. And of the records that were left, if you looked at the attribute combinations that could potentially be linkable, 40% of those were unique. And 80% linked to small groups smaller than 10. So this is quite a broad kind of privacy risk, again, that we would like to avoid. And so, if we think about requirements for sharing data on vulnerable populations, this approach fails on two key points. One is providing privacy guarantees that cover all attributes, and the other is preserving aggregate counts for official reporting. And we see that the K-anonymity approach used here just didn't meet those requirements. We could use differential privacy, and in particular a differentially private query mechanism to query the data set. That would solve those problems, but it would introduce other problems. It wouldn't make a data set available for analysis. It wouldn't allow unlimited queries. Differential privacy protects individuals, but not groups, and the privacy guarantees can be quite hard to explain. Now, there's a different implementation of differential privacy around how you can use those guarantees to create synthetic data that captures much of the qualities of the original data. This is a step in the right direction, but again, data produced in this way doesn't protect groups, it only protects individuals, and the privacy guarantees are, again, quite hard to explain. But we can combine the best of the ideas here to create synthetic data that has K-anonymity guarantees across all of its attribute columns, all of its attribute combinations. And this is the foundation of our approach. So what we do in our synthetic data showcase tool, which is currently available on GitHub, is to create synthetic data records only from attribute combinations that are common in the sensitive data. So if you find a unique attribute combination in the sensitive data set, you know by construction that it must describe a much larger group of individuals in the original sensitive data set. And so you can't link that combination to any actual person in the world, which is the privacy guarantee that you want. But if I give you some synthetic data, you may very reasonably ask, well, how well does this data set describe this particular group of victims that I care about? And so to help answer that question, we also generate aggregate data pre-computed for more short combinations of attributes in the sensitive data for interactive comparison. And we enable that within the context of a data dashboard built in Power BI. So our partners IOM have used this to create the first CTDC Global Human Trafficking Synthetic Data Set that was released in September this year. If you scroll down, you can find the dashboard that allows interactive exploration of this data set. And so I'll walk through the data now. On the left, you can see in light green estimated counts from the synthetic data. And over on the right, you can see in the dark green actual counts pre-computed from the sensitive data and rounded for release for privacy reasons. But you can see, again, by design, at the outset, the synthetic data perfectly captures the counts of all attributes in the sensitive data. And this is really useful. Compared to K-anonymity, we're not losing large chunks of data. We're retaining those data set level statistics. And you can see there are many, many attributes in this data set, and we don't know in advance which may be of interest to any particular user. So it's important that we capture and communicate all of them. Now, the whole idea of the dashboard is that you can drill down into your data to learn about different groups of individuals in the real world. And so here I've selected the year 2019 for the year of registration of these victims. And I can see how the counts from the actual sensitive data compare to the synthetic data, and we can see that those distributions pretty much maintain a close degree of similarity, even as I drill down into the data set. So here I'm looking at female victims of sexual exploitation in the USA. Again, those counts are captured quite well. I do notice here there are several attributes where the estimated count of victims is 1. That means it's a unique combination in the synthetic data set. But you can see that the actual count in each case is 30. So it's not a privacy risk, and that's our privacy guarantee in action. So as we keep adding attributes to our query, as we keep drilling down, as we keep making selections, at some point we run out of pre-computed combinations. But that's fine, because we're typically only looking at quite small groups by that stage, and hopefully we've built the user's confidence in the data set by showing accurate results at higher levels. So let's now look at a small data subset. So for exploitation in the USA, we can notice that there's around 100 or so victims from the Federated States of Micronesia, and you can see on the right that the tool has captured that population quite accurately. So we also have data on all forms of labor and sexual exploitation. We can use this to look for potential crossovers between those forms of exploitation. So for example, here I'm looking at a type of labor, hospitality, and I'm seeing some crossover with prostitution. And I'm seeing this as a particular issue for citizens of Cuba who are being exploited in the United States, mostly in 2019. So again, this is not conclusive evidence of a problem, but it's evidence that a problem exists and maybe deserves further investigation. So finally, I'm looking at recruiter relationships, and so I can see that where the recruiter is an intimate partner, that predominantly affects victims of sexual exploitation who are female, and the same applies for family recruiters. But if I look at friends, I see that forced labor is the most closely associated form of trafficking. And within victims of forced labor, we see that males kind of dominate females. So again, these are some of the kinds of insights that you can generate. Let's look at now for victims of trafficking who've been trafficked for a long time, 5 or more years. We can notice that this is a particular issue for citizens of Myanmar who are exploited in Indonesia. And again, if we're a policymaker who is involved in any of those countries, this could give us some at least preliminary guidance about what kind of thing we should be looking for that can help us to make progress against the problem. But again, all those hypotheses that we were just discussing, they're suggestive. They're not kind of conclusive. So the next stage is to try to develop evidence of causation from this observational data collected in the real world for some other purpose. So just as a reminder, this is the process we're trying to support, and these are the barriers that we're facing. The synthetic data showcase tool that you've just seen, it works by granting access by decision makers who are not data scientists to be able to view, explore, and make sense of private data for themselves. And the same tool can provide access to data if your goal is to develop some evidence of causation, but it doesn't address the issue of how do you make the data science of causal inference accessible to decision makers. This is a really hard problem. But thankfully, we had a great kind of place to start based on some work that was done by our partners through Microsoft Research studies in pandemic preparedness. So our partners at Johns Hopkins University and Stanford wrote a paper on rules for performing this kind of retrospective causal analysis of real-world data. In this case, it was for COVID drug discovery. But they also generated this list of guidelines for how to emulate a randomized controlled trial in the real world. And this is, we think, an excellent foundation for building a tool that makes this process of causal inference accessible to policymakers and decision makers. And what's critical about these methods is that, domain experts and domain expertise is critical, and it's conventionally represented as this kind of graph showing the causal relationships operating in the domain. But the problem is people don't tend to carry these graphs around in their head. They have to be elicited interactively. They take time to develop. And this is not something you can delegate to a data scientist who perhaps doesn't have domain knowledge. So what can you do? So our response is to build a tool that we're calling ShowWhy. So ShowWhy enables domain experts to evaluate causal questions over real-world data via a guided process without assuming too much kind kind of familiarity or expertise in data science and none in causal inference. And it works by emulating randomized controlled trials to the best extent possible using observational data already collected for some other purpose. SureWhy evaluates many alternative specifications to show the impact of decisions and assumptions made along the way, especially kind of essentially arbitrary decisions and thresholds that may potentially have an outsized impact on the resulting estimates. And finally, it encourages interactive presentation of the developed evidence and reproducible analysis through the download of interactive reports and code and things like Jupyter Notebooks. And we call it SureWhy because it's powered by causal inference using DoY and ecolML, two libraries for causal inference developed by Microsoft Research. So let's dive into a SureWhy demo now. So here's the tool. On the left, we can see a structured workflow that guides the user through the process of defining a question, acquiring data, estimating effect sizes against that data, and communicating those results. So, the kind of question that we can answer here is, for population, does exposure cause outcome to do something? Hypothesis, increase, decrease, or change. So here's a preloaded analysis on victims of trafficking. And the question is, for identified victims of trafficking, does the experience of a recent natural disaster in your country of citizenship as a victim cause the severity of control to increase, or cause the chance of you experiencing a severe means of control to increase? And again, there are various theories in the domain as to why this might be the case. So the tool kind of gets the user to document their question, the data sets that they might use, the reasoning behind it, and all the different ways in which they might define the different elements of the question. So for instance, in terms of the population, if we're using the CTDC synthetic data set, do we use complete records only, or are we allowed to impute some attribute values? There are two different ways of defining the people over which we'll do the analysis. And similarly, we can define different levels of exposure in terms of the degree of severity of the disaster, maybe also different levels of outcome. So these are all alternative framings of the same kind of high-level question. Next, we ask the user to think about all the possible factors that might be causally related to the question. And once they've kind of documented those, we can get them to think, one page at a time, which of those might cause the exposure, which might be caused by the exposure, and the same for the outcome. And again, along the way, we capture the user's kind of input in terms of how strongly they believe this to be the case and why they believe this to be the case. Once we have all that evidence of potential causal relationships with different degrees of belief, we can construct that kind of causal graph, and we can ask DoY on the back end to evaluate whether or not it's possible to evaluate the target question given the causal structure of the domain. And this is even before we've looked at any data. Based on the different degrees of belief that we have for whether these causal relationships exist, we can also kind of look at different causal models. So for example, this minimum model only includes age and gender, not anything linked to the countries of citizenship or exploitation. And the unadjusted model is just looking at the exposure and the outcome. So next, we've defined kind of our question. It's time to load data and process the data column by column, indicating whether or not it's causally relevant to different aspects of the question or the broader context. And so, the user is now systematically going through the definitions that they've created and either binding to existing columns in their data sets or using kind of built-in capabilities to derive new columns that kind of move towards the definition of the thing that they care about. So we do this for population, exposure, outcome, controls, and then we get to the stage where we have to determine how we're going to statistically estimate the effect size. And so, this is a real challenge in terms of how we communicate this. It's something that's in its early stages still, but you can see here that we're offering kind of inline guidance about different tools and techniques and when they might not be appropriate. And again, because the user is not necessarily an expert, it's best to err on the side of caution and select multiple different kinds of estimators. And similarly, we have different kinds of refutation tests we can use to try to reject any estimates that you create based on ones that appear to have some of their assumptions violated. So this is just an additional line of defense against invalid estimates. So once we have specified all these different ways of specifying the problem, we get all the specifications executed on the back end in parallel to produce all of these different estimates, all of which have been refuted multiple times. and this is the result. And so what we can see is a chart where we are ranking our effect sizes in increasing order. Effect sizes above 0 represent a positive impact, below 0 represent a negative impact. And we can see here these blue dots that I'm pointing to, these are from the unadjusted model. We know that's bad, so we can just eliminate those results and view the remaining points and how the exclusion of those estimates affects the mean and median effect size. Next, we can see that we have a whole kind of row of results from the minimum model that appear to be pushing the effect size downwards. Using machine learning, we can actually show that this is indeed the case, and we can argue that maybe that minimum model wasn't valid, it didn't capture all of our domain knowledge, and so we're not going to use that for our final analysis. The estimated selection didn't appear to make a significant systematic impact either way, which is good, but our definition of exposure did. So if we defined a severe disaster as one of the top 50% over all countries and all time, we see that has downward pressure on the results. But actually, we only really care about very severe disasters because only then do we really think that this phenomenon would occur. So we can eliminate those two forms of exposure, and we're left with two alternative ways of defining the population, from records that were already complete in the source data versus ones that we completed by imputation. And this is the CTDC synthetic data set, and what's nice to see here is that it doesn't really matter which one we use. We're getting kind of consistent results either way. So now we can go through the process of looking at the remaining estimates one by one and seeing how they fared when passed through this refutation process. And any results that don't pass kind of all of the refutations, we can just reject and say, okay, there's something wrong about this somehow. We could learn more by drilling down into the refutation tests that were failed, but for now, let's just dismiss them and see what kind of curve we're left with, and in particular, what the remaining average causal effect sizes look like. So we're almost finished with that process. This one passed all 5, this one passed all 5, and this one passed all 5. So that's great. And so we can see that we're looking at average effects of around 0.3, which means that for identified victims of trafficking, given this analysis, recent natural disaster does appear to increase the chance of experiencing a severe means of control by around 30%. And we can go on now to evaluate the hypothesis kind of formally, or we could save from this the entire project, the derived data sets, a report, or a Jupyter notebook containing the code of the analysis. I'd just like to point out that this is not a peer-reviewed study, it's just an illustrative example of the kinds of question that you can answer using show why. And so here's a snapshot of the kind of notebook that you can generate. It's too long to go through in detail. It's not the kind of thing that a decision maker or a domain expert would generate, but it's something that you could pass to somebody who is an expert in data science or causal inference to validate or audit the work that you have done. Okay, so today I've been talking about translating raw data into evidence. This is the process we're trying to support. It has barriers along the way, and today I've described 2 tools that help to overcome those barriers. So one is Synthetic Data Showcase for private data sharing, the other is Show Why based on Do Why for guided causal inference. And so I've shown examples in the human trafficking space, but I hope you can appreciate that these tools have very broad relevance across domains, especially for healthcare and public health, or any issue of health equity. So Synthetic Data Showcase is available on GitHub now, as is Do Why. Show Why will be coming to GitHub in December 2021. And these are not independent tools. They're designed to be complementary. They're designed to work together. And Synthetic Data Showcase can be used to share data inputs for retrospective analysis to Show Why, just as the data outputs from Show Why can be passed through Synthetic Data Showcase to enable a more reproducible, auditable, and privacy-preserving kind of analysis. And again, both of these kind of considerations are about creating a more equitable and collaborative form of data science, and that's just what we need to solve problems like trafficking, healthcare, public health, and all the other challenges of societal resilience. And to learn more about our efforts in this space, please navigate to aka.ms/societal resilience and select research. Thank you very much.